Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain to reveal the hidden vulnerabilities of the economic metrics that basically run our world. We hear these numbers thrown around every single day on the news, in political debates, in corporate boardrooms. But honestly, how often do we actually stop to question their absolute accuracy? We're focusing on a fascinating yet super misunderstood topic: the limitations of index numbers.
We usually treat economic data like absolute gospel, right? We see a percentage tick up or down and just immediately accept it as a definitive reflection of reality. But today, we're going to see why assuming these numbers are flawless is actually a really dangerous illusion. To truly understand our economy, we have to look at the cracks in the foundation of the very data we use to measure it. All right, let's jump right in. At their core, index numbers are intended to be the ultimate barometers of our economy. Think of a meteorologist using a barometer to predict a storm. Economists use index numbers to track relative changes in things like prices, production, and the cost of living over a period of time. They aren't physical things you can touch, but rather statistical tools built to spot a trend. And these tools are absolutely everywhere. Take the government of India, for instance. They rely on heavy hitters like the Consumer Price Index, the Wholesale Price Index, and the Index of Industrial Production. These aren't just, dusty academic concepts. They're the actual gears turning real world policy, dictating everything from national agricultural plans to exactly how much millions of employees get paid. But here is where it gets incredibly tricky. If these numbers hold so much power over our wallets and our lives, why are they sometimes just spectacularly wrong? How does a metric designed to perfectly capture the economy completely miss the mark? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at the specific limitations inherent in how they're built.
Scene 1, based on samples and inaccurate data.
Picture this: a massive warehouse stacked to the ceiling with tens of thousands of different consumer items. That warehouse, that represents the wild, incredibly complex reality of an actual economy. Millions of transactions, crazy price swings, just a huge variety of stuff. It is literally impossible to track every single item, everywhere, all at once. So, since economists can't inventory that entire giant warehouse, they have to settle for a tiny sample. A researcher might just check 5 random consumer products out of thousands and throw in some hastily scribbled, unverified price entries on a clipboard. You can see where this is going, right? The source material explicitly warns us that data collection is highly prone to bias and simple human error. The big takeaway here: index numbers rely heavily on limited samples and absolutely suffer from data inaccuracies. If the data going in is garbage, or even just slightly off, the final index number is going to be completely skewed from day one. Scene 2, formula bias and shifting customs. Straight from our sources, we get this huge warning sign. There is no such thing as a universally perfect statistical index formula. Nope. Whether you're using a simple aggregative method or something complex like Laspers or Paschis, they're all ultimately all just averages. And averages carry all kinds of inherent biases and defects. There's just no magical equation that works flawlessly for every situation. Plus, there's another major wrinkle here. The math stays exactly the same year after year, but we don't. Human behavior changes constantly. Imagine trying to measure the economy based on someone throwing away an old radio, while today they're out buying a modern smartphone. Our habits, tastes, and expectations are in a constant state of flux. An index built on the customs of 20 years ago is going to be completely blind to how we actually spend our money today. Basically, a rigid, static formula cannot perfectly capture a dynamic, breathing economy. Formulas have inherent biases and often completely miss these shifts in consumer habits. When the economy moves on, but the math doesn't, the index just turns into a ghost of the past. Scene 3, misuse and base year decay. You might be tempted to think an index is some universal truth, but context is literally everything. Imagine a company trying to use an index designed for wholesale heavy machinery to analyze an individual consumer's retail grocery basket. That is a classic, downright dangerous misuse of data. You're taking a highly specialized metric and forcing it onto a totally unrelated situation. And then there's the issue of time. Every single index number relies on a base year, a reference point in the past to compare current prices against. But if that base year was chosen decades ago, like in 1980,
It rapidly decays and loses relevance as economic structures change. Our sources point out that this actually opens the door to deliberate manipulation. A savvy business person could easily cherry-pick a distant, super profitable base year to artificially make a current massive failure look like a tiny, temporary dip. It's wild how malleable these tools are. Indices can be easily misused, and older base years quickly lose relevance. Pick the wrong metric or an outdated baseline, and you can practically make the data tell whatever story you want.
Scene 4. Limited scope.
Fundamentally, an index number is a specialized tool. Say a researcher calculates an index based specifically on the local economy of a massive industrial steel factory. If you then try to apply that exact same index to measure the cost of living in a quiet rural farming village, it's going to yield completely meaningless results. The goods purchased, the wages earned, the whole nature of daily transactions, they are totally different worlds. So the takeaway here is simple but super important. Every index has a highly limited scope and cannot be generalized broadly. You can't just blanket a single metric across an entire diverse nation without losing incredible amounts of accuracy. Ultimately, the source material leaves us with this really grounding reminder. Let me read it for you. Index numbers are useful in practice. However, they suffer from certain limitations. Therefore, they are not completely reliable. We definitely can't throw them out. They're absolutely essential for tracking inflation and framing policy, but they are far from infallible. Which brings us to the ultimate question for you. Knowing all these flaws, the tiny sample sizes, the biased formulas, the decaying base years, and their strictly limited scope, how much should you actually trust those bold economic headlines you read every day? Next time you see a statistic reported as an unquestionable fact on the news, you've got to ask yourself, what is this data hiding? And who exactly chose the formula? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the numbers.